Welcome to your guide to Russian literature. Ranging from books to podcasts and artwork to coffee, these items will prepare you for your indulgence in Russian stories, acclimating you to the depths of heartbreak, confusion, and queasiness presented in the philosophical and religious accounts. Each of these recommendations addresses a specific part of Russian literature that distinguishes this genre from every other type of literature in the world. Russian literature reveals the heartbreak and pain of life, coupled with the joy and success that ultimately encourages you to find your purpose in the world. There's no doubt that your life will change in at least one way after reading any of these Russian stories. However, in order to fully absorb the meaning and depth of the stories, you must create the ideal Russian atmosphere enveloped by heart-wrenching emotions and philosophical questioning. Therefore, may I present the American Consumer's Guide to Russian Literature. Let's first begin with book recommendations. So the next 5 books that I will be mentioning touch on topics present in Russian literature, i.e. the meaning of life, how we can navigate life amid difficult situations, how the choices we make impact our view of our life, as well as the importance of individual growth to foster understanding and inspiration. So the first book is Brief Answers to the Big Questions by Stephen Hawking. This book discusses the 10 biggest questions, including is there a God, how did it all begin, will we survive on Earth, etc. These questions are some that definitely appear in Russian literature, discussing where life began and how we move past the roadblocks that occur in life. Not only does this book mention topics that are prevalent in Russian literature or that are alluded to, it also directly mentions some Russian lit authors, including Dostoevsky, which is definitely a telltale sign that you should read this book if you want to get the feeling of Russian literature. Russian literature, like this book, discusses some of the most deep, confusing questions that we have, but also provides solutions in the end, although they're not the most straightforward or easy to understand. They do provide us some confidence in knowing that there is an answer to the questions that we are asking, which Russian literature can give us. The next book is Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine by Alan Lightman. This book discusses concepts of science and philosophy and religion and really how they intersect in our daily life. This author details how his experience on this tiny island in Maine really causes him to reflect on his life. And just like in Russian literature, when we kind of see the initial thoughts of the characters, they think retrospectively about their lives or look forward to what's to come in the future. They uncover more about who they are as a person, but also what they view as society. That's the same that we can see in this book here. As for discussing these two books together, something that is very evident between them is the idea of solidifying your own personal views. Both in these books, they talk about philosophy and science and religion that are topics that are deliberated over and discussed a lot because most people have very differing views of how we think the world was created, how science interweaves throughout our life, how religion is involved, whether it is questioning what the author is saying or believing exactly what they're saying because it aligns with your beliefs. It is imperative that we read these books to understand more of who we are as people, which is exactly what occurs in Russian literature. Reading Russian literature helps stretch our imagination to the depths that we didn't think were attainable. In Russian literature, oftentimes the characters look back at their life retrospectively. They're thinking about the decisions that they have made and the things that they would have changed, as well as how that will then impact their future, which is definitely a topic that is prevalent in Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This book details stories of 4 different characters who go and sit in this cafe that when you sit in a specific chair and you have a specific cup of coffee, you can travel back in time to a certain place. You have to do that all before the coffee gets cold though. So this is definitely a topic that we can see relates to Russian literature in the sense that Russian literature often shows that a definite amount of time and we don't always have the time to pursue all of our interests or to fix everything in life. Just as Russian lit causes us to think retrospectively about our lives and make decisions that heal our inner self, Before the Coffee Gets Cold and the concept of the coffee shop taking us back in time details the difficulty of finding enough time to achieve what you want while taking care of those who are around you. This book focuses more on the intangible parts of life rather than the material items that typically separate us from our true desires in life and that ultimately fulfill our souls more, which is exactly what Russian lit does. It digs at our souls rather than at our surface level idea of what we want in the world. It gives us more of an understanding of who we are as people and who we are deep down rather than what society tells us to be. The second to last book that I recommend to read as a guide to Russian literature is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. This book is written from a therapist's point of view about her experience with therapy and also with those who she is a therapist towards. This book details not only her own experience but others' experiences, and it shows the intersections between different people's lives and the way that we all think about the world. Each person is living their own life independently of each other, and this book creatively highlights the way that we all interact and the intricacies of our lives. These same intricacies and complex relationships that are evident in daily life are evident in the stories of Russian literature. Like in Quadraturin, for example, we see the main character who's really struggling with his desire for more, but on the outside, the proprietor who owns the building has no idea what's going on inside, and she's living her own completely separate life. And same with the girlfriend who doesn't know what's going on at home. It shows the complexities of our lives and how we never understand what's going on in someone else's life, or that idea of finding out who you are, but knowing that you are in the right place at the right time and discovering the true meaning behind your relationship with someone else, whether it be your mom, your dad, a friend, a boyfriend, anything like that. Those relationships individually all contribute to your overall character, which is exactly what Russian Lit shows. The fifth and final book that I would recommend if you are reading Russian literature and to get the vibes of Russian literature is called To Hell with the Hustle by Jefferson Bethke. This is a self-help book that details the internal struggles that we face when our mind is distracted on the pulls and pressures of society and the world around us instead of focusing on what is true to us, whether it be God or religion or personal improvement. When we are too focused on what the world wants from us and what society expects from us, that pulls us away from maybe what actually we want in life, is exactly what is detailed in this novel. Russian literature includes stories of individuality and ones that do not follow the traditional norms of society, that branch out, and it's typically those characters that, yes, may struggle along the way, but they find themselves and they figure out who they are and who they are meant to be. It deals with the philosophical elements of discovering the meaning of life. These characters deal with the struggle of being distracted by their appearance, just in the nose, where the character fixates so much on the nose that it ends up becoming a live person and walking around town, and it draws him away from his actual purpose in life and from who he is, and that's something he fixates on and misses out on the rest of life. When we fixate on something in society or on one grade, it draws us from our friendships, from what fuels our soul, what brings us joy. It takes away from the joy of life that we can find if we just let go of the pressures of society and we indulge in what we actually want. So although none of these books were written by Russian authors, they each highlight different aspects of Russian literature. They dive into the philosophical and scientific and religious conversations, but they also dive into the moral and intellectual side of understanding who you are meant to be, how to focus on yourself, but also how to learn about the world around. And these stories will help you get there and help you as a person, when reading Russian literature, understand more of your purpose, and then diving into these, it becomes more tangible and you understand the steps to get there. Now, some people don't have time to read all of these books. Here are some podcast recommendations that can be a quick hour listen that gets you thinking before indulging in a Russian literature book.
The first podcast I would recommend is called Future You, published by TED Radio Hour. The main idea surrounds each individual's ability, conscious or not, to think about their future self or make changes in their lives that impact their future self. The scientific perspective explains a study that was conducted where patients were asked to think about their future selves and their current selves. The data showed that different parts of the brain reacted when thinking about these two entities. In fact, the future self aligned more with that of a stranger who you only know a little bit about. Humans cannot grasp the concept of our future self because in our brains, that self is classified as a different person, whom we don't know. It is difficult to try and perform actions now that will impact our future selves without resistance. This topic of the future and what is out of our reach arises in Russian literature as well. The philosophical and scientific concepts of the present versus the future and what is and isn't real consume the minds of the Russian characters. We see how characters lose control of their lives and fixate on a single entity that draws them away from their joys in life and the community around them. Keeping an open mind that allows for the unexpected will in turn help us strengthen our connection to our future self. Instead of focusing on specific things that you want to change, look at the person who you want to become. In Russian stories, we see multitudes of character growth that create resolutions or instill confidence in the characters. The people that remain uptight and rigid in their views are the ones in the stories where they meet their demise. However, the characters that embrace the uncertainty of the future typically succeed at their goals. The second podcast I would recommend is called Chaos or Conscience: A Republican Explains His Vote to Oust McCarthy by The Daily. Throughout this episode, the host converses with the Republican representative Tim Burchett about his views surrounding the ousting of the House Speaker. Although Russian literature does not directly discuss this government interest, many of the stories were written to informally address the government. Because of the strict government that suffocated Russians from speaking their mind aloud, authors used their written works to bring awareness to an issue prevalent in the lives of the Russian people. Many Russians found that novels and short stories were the key to gaining attention from the government for at least a small period of time. This podcast emphasizes the importance of voting your conscience rather than adhering to the views of society. The representative discusses his revolution and once supporting Speaker McCarthy to voting against keeping him in legislation. Although as a Republican, Burchett would be expected to align with the views and desires of McCarthy and the other Republicans, he recognizes the power of his voice and how the situation contradicts his beliefs towards the government. As McCarthy chases power and success, Burchett solidifies his own beliefs that influence his leadership. In Russian literature, we are told to find the strength that will allow us to stand up for what we believe in. As a lot of the Russian government's actions influence the authors to create magnificent stories, it is important to educate ourselves on the events in the government and the reasons behind leaders' choices. Ultimately, Russian literature focuses on turning away from the requirements and expectations of the government to lean into the power of the individual. The final recommendation for a podcast to listen to that describe Russian literature is Heartache from the TED Radio Hour. Surprisingly, many Russian literature stories contain the themes of love, passion, and heartbreak. Some stories are written directly as love stories, like In Paris, while others include sprinkles of love throughout. The romance allows characters to focus on what brings them joy amidst a world of difficult work, a brutal government, and harsh living situations. Instead of dwelling on what the characters don't have, they can find relief in the passion of love, whether it be with another person, with themselves, or even with the day-to-day life. Unfortunately, a common theme in Russian stories revolves around heartbreak, emotional typically. Oftentimes, it weakens the character's will to progress through life, falling into the traps of sorrow. However, if the characters search for it, they can find a cure to their pain. The same topic is discussed in the podcast, where we hear from stories of people's deep sadness and fear that cause a physical and emotional pain. Yet the speakers provide relevant, attainable ways of mending your heart and soothing the heartbreak. Ultimately, the information that we absorb from the outside world should be what compels us to look introspectively and create a life we are proud of and excited about.
Now on to the final category of recommendations, which is coffee. Here are the 4 best types of coffee drinks that invoke a similar feeling to that of Russian literature and contain flavors that resemble the turmoil and conflicts in the stories. First up in recommendations for coffee is an iced cortado. This drink seems like it's just going to be kind of like a sweeter drink, and then you take a sip and all of the espresso flavor bursts out, and it's kind of overwhelming. It's very strong, but it definitely resembles that of Russian literature. It seems like it's going to be a manageable topic to read. The stories seem surface level, and then when you really dive into them and dissect them, like what is going on, this is confusing. They're very philosophical and cause you to think deeply about your life, as it's not just an overwhelming story that you don't know where to go from there. It causes you to think about your life retrospectively, think about the ways that you want to handle relationships with other people or day-to-day life, and then when you think about that, you can go apply it to your life after reading this. The second recommendation for someone who is learning about Russian literature and wanting to engage in the stories is to drink drip coffee, which allows you to slow down your day. Oftentimes in life, we rush to get things done and just check items off of our to-do list. However, in the midst of that, we get caught up in fulfilling the expectations for the day and miss out on the mundane parts of life that typically define its beauty. Although sometimes life can feel like it's beating you down and you can't recover, taking the time to refocus your life, usually with the assistance of something like a slow brewing pot of coffee, will lead you back to where you want to be. The same is evident in Russian literature. We see flawed characters embracing the world around them, investigating life to the point of questioning what is and isn't real. However, the curiosity that arises in this type of literature pulls not only the characters, but the reader as well, deeper into the story, blurring the line between reality and fiction and distracting the reader from their own personal life. Not only should you have drip coffee to emphasize the slowness of life, but these 2 specific blends of drip coffee establish an aroma that radiates the scents and tastes of Russian literature. Firstly, Ethiopian mocha is noted as a full-body coffee, with notes of pine, cedar, pipe tobacco, and cocoa powder. The contradiction of the flavors of tobacco and chocolate demonstrate the range of emotions and stories that Russian literature tells. You never know what to expect in the stories and to what depth the author will reveal philosophical and scientific perspectives of life. The second drip coffee you should have is called Celebes Colossi, which is a spicy coffee known for its boldness throughout, including flavors of tobacco, thyme, and pepper. The spiciness that emerges in this coffee defines Russian literature, as there are often forms of protest in a story, or an emphasis on a specific part of the Russian identity and life that can be fixed if the government were to change. Addressing these matters in a fictional way is a spicy nudge to the government to improve their policies and improve the Russian citizens' daily life. So for recommendation number 2 for coffee, have some drip coffee. The third coffee drink for the eager Russian lit student is cold brew. This is mine that I got from a local coffee shop. Upon initial taste, it is strong and rich. However, as the taste settles, the flavor bursts out, deepening your enjoyment of the drink. The bitterness subsides and hidden flavors arise. In this, it's chocolate, fruit, and marshmallow. With a dash of cinnamon on the top of the cold brew, the flavors come together in harmony to form the delicious, nutty, and powerful drink. Similar to the drip coffee, cold brew takes time to create. It is steeped over a period of at least 8 hours, typically averaging about 12. This prolonged period of making the coffee to finally getting to drink it resembles that of the messages behind stories in Russian literature. Oftentimes, there is a long process and subplot within the story that is confusing and seems irrelevant, until you reach the climax of the story where not only the message is revealed, but the reader recognizes the importance of the small details along the way. Cold brew is the same way. It takes time to enhance each individual flavor, ensuring that the drinker embraces the atmosphere the coffee creates and the aroma that emerges. The richness and dark strength in the coffee expresses the same qualities found in Russian literature. The dark, confusing, sometimes scary stories that lead us to a deeper philosophical message about the world. So if you are interested in getting engaged in Russian literature, definitely get yourself a cold brew when you're reading. My final recommendation for a type of coffee that represents Russian literature is called a jumpstart, better known as brewed coffee and espresso mixed together. This coffee jumps right out at you. It is surprising on the first taste and will give you an immediate thrill, in this case from the caffeine. When taking the time to actually sip the drink, however, you can deduce which flavors are coming from the brewed coffee and which ones originate in the espresso. Initially, in the brewed coffee, it tastes more light with subtle flavors. However, when the espresso comes in, it covers the lightness by adding depth to the taste in a strong and robust way. In comparison to Russian literature, some stories seem very surface level, lacking a purpose and typically discussing the mundane parts of life. But the author, sometimes utilizing the power of Chekhov's gun, will emphasize a specific, minuscule part of the story that ends up playing a major role in the resolution and final message. It is important that we don't abandon the brewed coffee moments nor the espresso moments, instead embracing both flavors individually as they contribute to the drink or story as a whole. These are all of my recommendations for coffees that resemble Russian literature that you should try. Enjoy your journey through the stories and culture of Russian literature using uniquely American media to encapsulate these foreign philosophies.